Lem was not a poor man. Now, you might say to me, Hoyd, this entire story has shown me the opposite. Lem's family is always scrimping to survive. And I would reply, please stop interrupting. Lem was not poor, he simply didn't have a lot of money. That night as Tress slept, Lem limped down the long road. I'm Bethany Davidson.
I'm Ben Grange, and this is Cosmere Journeys.
In each episode of Cosmere Journeys, we read the chapters of the week through the lens of a specific Cosmere shard. The shards are the deities of Brandon Sanderson's literary universe, and each shard encapsulates a specific attribute. The shard lens we'll be looking through this week is Cultivation. Ben, before we dive into our discussion, let's play a quick game of Hoyd or Hoax. I'm going to read you 3 quotes, and your job is to decide which ones were actually said by Hoyd in the Cosmere. 2 of them will be genuine Hoyd quotes, and 1 of them is going to be a hoax. To make things trickier, the hoax is an introspective line from another fantasy novel that I think could easily fool you. Are you ready?
Let's do it.
All right, quote number 1 is, "It's like everyone tells a story about themselves inside their own head. Always, all the time, that story makes you what you are. We build ourselves of that story." I forgot to mention every quote today has to do with stories. Quote number 2 is, "Art, and all stories are art, even the ones about real people, is about what it does to you." And quote number 3 is, "All stories told have been told before. We tell them to ourselves, as did all men who ever were, and all men who ever will be. The only things new are the names."
Okay, I'm putting my victory streak on the line here. I'm 1 for 1 so far with Hoyd or Hoax. Can I make it 2 for 2? This is really tricky because Hoyd is a storyteller and all of his stories have the word story in them or something to that effect. He is always talking about stories. So you have made this extremely difficult. But I think I'm not even gonna ask you to read them again this time, but I think that the first quote is not the Hoyd quote.
That's insane. You're correct.
There we go. Okay,
Wow.
2 for 2.
I tried to make that harder because of the stories. I thought that would be impossible, but...
Yes, it's just, I think Hoyd has a very distinct voice, and there were just like 2 words in that segment, in that sentence that you said, that I was like, would Hoyd use those words? Probably not. That's the only thing that clued me into it.
Yeah, no, you're totally right. That first quote was from The Name of the Wind. I don't know if you've read that book before, but it's one of Abe's favorites. And so I thought it was a fun one to include. I thought that I would trip you up with this group, but you are 2 for 2 for our Hoyd or Hoax games.
I'm really nervous now because can I maintain that for the next time we play Hoyd or Hoax and keep it 3 for 3? When is it going to be the time where I lose a Hoyd or Hoax game?
Ooh, to be determined. I'll do my best next week to make it even harder.
All right. I'm looking forward to it. In Chapter 7, Lem, Tress's father, sets out to do that bit of advanced fathering we hinted at in the last episode. He goes to Brick's Tavern, where the local community spends its evenings after a long day's work. There, the villagers have cultivated an unconventional game of darts that allows them to take their frustrations out on the monarchy in a non-violent way. During games of darts, Lem talks with his neighbors and friends, and soon word spreads that Lem needs help from the dockworkers, but he doesn't ask for it. These people simply know that something is needed, and they all rise to the call. Within a week, Tress and her parents work with the dockworkers to execute the plan they've meticulously put together, and when the right ship finally arrives at Diggins Point, Tress sneaks on board. Not in a barrel of cargo, which the inspector would have caught, but in plain sight, dressed as the inspector herself.
And then in Chapter 8, Tress sails away on the ship, watching from afar as the real inspector shows up late, just as she planned. Tress feels free, but also feels a heaviness as she leaves the only home she's ever known. She reflects on how her escape was a success and wonders if her entire journey will continue to go off without a hitch. Tress makes a plan to find her way into the king's palace to find Charlie's ransom note and persuade the king to pay it. The captain of the ship joins her on the quarterdeck as she watches the sea and fears the spores around her. She excuses herself to her cabin to get away from the captain and drinks some water that had been poisoned by the captain's order. She begins to hallucinate as she falls unconscious.
Bethany, you left out one of my favorite parts about the captain
Oh
because
no.
Hoyd describes him as this like what you would find in the bottom part of your shower drain, which I always thought was so
I forgot
gross
about that.
and so funny. This episode of Cosmere Journeys is brought to you by the 3030 Writing Challenge. 3030 is a community with thousands of writers from all over the world. The challenge takes place 4 times every year, and the goal is to write 30,000 words in 30 days. Complete each goal, and you'll have more than enough material for a full novel. So, if you struggle with motivation or consistency, or even if you just want a community to cheer you on as you work on your novel, join 3030 at 3030k.com. That's THIRTY30k.com, and get ready to make some real progress on your novel.
In 1997, in a small rural town in Colombia, Luis Soriano took a chance on something that would have a profound impact on countless lives. After graduating from high school, Luis started his career as a primary school teacher, specializing in writing and reading. He loved his job, but he noticed that his students often didn't complete their homework and weren't making any progress on their reading. As a new teacher, he initially blamed himself for their lack of progress, but soon realized there was a systemic problem at play. His students were curious and eager to learn, but their access to knowledge stopped when they left the classroom. His students had no access to books. With very little money but a desire to cultivate these young minds, Luis thought of an unusual idea. He personally owned about 70 books, including dictionaries and history books, and he decided to personally bring these books to his students to assist them with their homework. Many of these students resided on remote farms, some 40 minutes or more of a walk away, and he was aware that he wouldn't be able to carry these heavy books by himself over a long period of time, so he devised a plan to place them on the backs of 2 donkeys. When asked what he was doing, he put it simply: it's a library mounted on a donkey. And this humble project became known as the Biblioburro, which translates to the donkey library. To this day, nearly 30 years later, Luis still travels by teachers' word of mouth to visit new towns with limited resources. He helps kids and adults learn to read and write and has made an irrefutable impact on countless people. In 2010, Luis had a terrible accident where he fell off one of his donkeys and was trampled under the other, and as a result, he lost one of his legs. But after some time to adjust to his prosthetic leg, he started right back up with the Biblioburro, and Luis was recently quoted saying, "I've guided young people who are currently practicing medicine. I've guided doctors, bankers, taxi drivers, housewives. Many of them have come to thank me for the time and patience I've had with them. And to be reminded of all that just fills my soul, and that's the greatest reward."
That's an interesting story. When you said 1997, I was relatively certain the mode of transportation in this story would not be donkeys. It makes it seem much older than just 30 years ago, but this is a great reminder that not everyone has access to technology, even today. And I love how dedicated Luis is in his mission to educate young minds. Imagine having to walk 40 minutes to get to work every day, not having a car, and deciding that in order to best fulfill your role as an educator, you'd use pack animals to build a mobile library. I think that just makes Luis an awesome person. So Bethany, how are you going to tie this into our Cosmere conversation today?
You know, I used to be a full-time teacher, and Luis's story is really inspiring to me because he didn't have money or resources to start this project with. He just had this strong desire to cultivate the minds of his students and to nurture these skills that they needed to thrive later in life. He had a problem he cared deeply about and a willingness to invest his own time and resources to make this difference. Teaching is already such a challenging job as it is, and I relate to Luis's start to his career so much because I started my first full-time teaching job at a Title I charter school right after COVID, when my students had just finished a year and a half of fully remote learning. I was a math teacher, and my 7th grade students started the year at about a 2nd or 3rd grade math level due to already being behind before the remote learning. And it's incredibly overwhelming and daunting to realize that your students aren't anywhere near the learning stage you expect them to be at. So I have a ton of admiration for this teacher who dedicated his life to cultivating his students' skills beyond what anyone would have ever expected of him. The difference he makes by providing these resources and a supportive environment is profound and has completely changed the trajectory of so many lives. And cultivation doesn't happen by chance. It requires that active effort and patience to accomplish that Luis shows every single day. I think it's the perfect lens for these chapters because we're going to see Tress's father, Lem, rely heavily on cultivation to help Tress get started on her journey.
I did not know that you used to be a teacher. I think that's awesome. And I agree. I think cultivation is a great shard to use as the theme for these next two chapters. So let's put on our shard lenses to see where cultivation may be pulling the strings. Bethany, where did you first see cultivation in these chapters?
Something that stood out right away for me was in chapter 7 when we saw the way Lem was able to help Tress. Lem recognized that he didn't have the ability to help his daughter in the ways she needed single-handedly, which is where that advanced fathering came in. He knew he needed the help of the dock worker, the dock master, and the brewer, which sounds like a tall order, but Lem had built these connections over the course of years that made this attainable for him. Hoyt tells us stories of Lem helping numerous people in his community when they needed a hand, and Hoyt describes him as the human equivalent of a deep, pure well, which I love, always full of water when you needed it. He'd offer what they needed, and he'd ask for nothing in return, and because of this, he was wealthy in the currency of human connections. Lem cultivated these relationships for so long that he knew he could rely on these people when he needed them, providing Tress exactly what she needed to execute her escape.
When you put it like that, I think Lem is a pure vessel for cultivation. There's something so wholesome and honorable in the act of giving to your neighbors with no thought of anything in return. Growing up, this was one of the main tenets of the religion that my parents taught me. Service to others for the pure intent to do good with no expectation of payment. And while I don't practice that religion anymore, it's one of the things that I still hold most valuable about my upbringing. When my neighbors, friends, and family need help, I always strive to contribute however I can. When you give of yourself freely, consistently, you'll find that those you give to have a desire to reciprocate, and that's exactly what makes Lem so rich here, his years of cultivated service to others. Now that I'm thinking more about this, Tress had to spend a lot of time cultivating her plan too. And in our last episode, we had an in-depth conversation about the concepts of brilliance and ideas. Tress says in an earlier chapter that although they might not be brilliant, they devise a plan made of small steps that put together might seem brilliant from the outside. This is a beautiful example of cultivation. A lot of effort over a period of time to bring something worthwhile into existence.
I love that insight because I think everybody has a tendency to have self-doubt like Tress and her family had in the previous chapters. It's like a universal human experience to think we aren't capable of certain things, whether that be a job that feels out of reach or a degree in school you're intimidated to pursue. But when you break it down into those small steps, those goals can start to seem attainable. So Ben, where did you first see cultivation in these chapters?
You know, one of the things that stood out to me was this game of darts that Lem plays with his friends at the tavern. Now, when I said dart game, the game you imagined is pretty much the game at this tavern. There are darts, a target, and two players. They take turn throwing darts, but Lem and his friends do not aim at the target. Instead, over time, they've cultivated new rules to this game of darts because on the wall around the target, the knots in the wood look remarkably like the Duke's face, and there are a pair of small circular knots just below where his midsection would be that the villagers particularly enjoy aiming at. I love this little detail that Hoyt shares. It gives so much personality to the tavern and shows how important it is to the villagers. It's where they spend their time, cultivating their relationships, creating silly games that take their minds off of their troubles. Ultimately, this tavern is what allows Lem to put the finishing touches on the plan that Tress has spent so long cultivating.
Yeah, that tavern definitely provides them that safe environment that allows them to freely engage with each other and build those important connections that ultimately Lem was able to lean on. It reminds me of the environment that Tress was given when she brought up her idea of leaving the island to her parents. They were a safe space for her and they gave her that support and encouragement that allowed her to flourish in her cultivation of this very detailed escape plan. At the end of chapter 7, we saw the culmination of all of these small steps that led her to this moment. We saw Tress as a fake inspector, a decoy stowaway that she discovered and made a whole scene about, and the real inspector, most importantly, arriving angrily at the dock too late after being told the incorrect time. This plan's brilliance was in those small details like the dockmaster's daughter acting as a decoy stowaway, and Tress knowing exactly how to act as the inspector because she had taken the time to study and observe her. Earlier, she had stated that if she was going to do something as stupid as leave the island, she figured she should be meticulous about it. Perhaps that would dilute the stupidity with time. It's a funny quote, but it's ultimately what led to her success, her and Lem meticulously planning out the steps that would make the seemingly impossible possible.
I want to shift gears here just for a second and highlight something really interesting about Chapter 8 that ties in with the idea of cultivation. In one segment, Hoyd tells us the exact science of how the ocean works on this world. Deep below the sea, vents release gases from under the ocean's floor, causing a phenomenon called fluidization. Now, Sanderson is known for coming up with some really creative and wild magic systems, but this phenomenon is actually possible, and Hoyd tells us so. Pump air into a box of sand and watch as it becomes fluidized, enabling objects with the proper density to float along the top. I just find this really interesting. In a universe with so many mystical and fantastical possibilities, the maker of this particular world decided to use simple physics to cultivate a unique and beautiful ocean.
I love that. I honestly was struggling to come up with something that had to do with cultivation in Chapter 8, but I think you nailed it with that one. Now, I think that everything we've talked about today has come down to an individual's willingness to take the time and effort to cultivate the relationships and the environments that they want in their lives. With Louise's story, he wanted a classroom of readers, so he dedicated his life to cultivating a learning environment that allowed these young students to learn to read and write, opening the doors for them to pursue the professions they dreamed of. For Lem, he cultivated friendships and relationships with the townspeople based on a history of him being a consistent and eager helping hand to his community. And for Tress, she saw an impossible goal and she slowed down to carefully cultivate the perfect plan, leaning on her family for help and taking small intentional steps to achieve this goal. Now, in a society that focuses so much on a fast pace of life with less and less social connection, I find it unfortunately really easy to let community fall through the cracks. I think we all love the idea of having a community of support to lean on, but aren't necessarily taking the steps to build one ourselves. It's something that doesn't happen by accident or solely from someone else's efforts. We have to choose to take steps towards it if we want it. I have a friend who inspires me regularly in this way because she is just like Lem. She has this eagerness to help everyone she knows, and I've seen her lend a car to a friend. I've seen her give her spare bedroom when somebody is in between houses and bring food or care baskets if someone's not feeling well. She's even used her connections to help find friends jobs, and the list just goes on and on. She would truly give the shirt off her back to help a friend, and she's that kind of support that everyone wants to have in their life, but not everyone takes the initiative to be that person for others. So whether your goal is cultivating young minds like Luis or cultivating a supportive community like Lem, I encourage you to join me in using this as a reminder for yourself to consciously and proactively put in the effort and the time to take small steps to cultivate the environment and relationships you want to have.
It's time to look through the realms of the Cosmere and ponder the hidden meanings of these chapters. Realmatic theory analysis is a mechanism that we developed to read a scene, paragraph, or sentence in the Cosmere and seek to understand it from the three realms of the Cosmere: the physical realm, the cognitive realm, and the spiritual realm. In other words, how the characters and objects are experienced through primary senses, how they are perceived by each other and themselves, and how their souls are connected. Bethany, what passage are we looking at for realmatic theory analysis today?
In our shard analysis, we focused a lot on Chapter 7, so I wanted to pick a passage from Chapter 8, and it says, "Leaving didn't feel exciting, it felt heavy. Every child looked forward to the day when they could choose a different path from the one their parents were on. Tress sincerely hoped she hadn't decided on one that led straight off a cliff. But she was free. She'd escaped without a hitch." So Ben, the first step is to look at the physical realm. What are these characters feeling and what is before them?
Tress is leaving her island for the first time in her life. This is such a big moment for her, and she's probably looking out at the vast openness of the Spore Sea and wondering what adventures lie in store for her. So I'm thinking that the two things before her are the ocean and adventure.
Yeah, I agree. This is absolutely such a huge moment for her. It's something she's never experienced before, and just a few weeks ago, she probably never thought she would. I imagine she's taking in all these unfamiliar sights and smells. Hoyt tells us she's seeing the blue sky for the first time unobstructed from the mining smog and smelling clean air without the salty scent she's used to. She's also seeing the only home she's ever known gradually shrink before her eyes as she sails away, and I can imagine how bittersweet this moment must be, knowing her loved ones are growing increasingly distant on that island, and the unsettling but also exciting feeling of uncertainty about what the future of her adventure holds.
I love that you brought that up because it brings up such a stark contrast to where we live in our world. When we visit the ocean, we experience this salty oceanic scent, and when we come back to land, it is normal. But with Tress, it is exactly the opposite. She goes to the ocean and the air is pure and clean, and she loses that smell of salt that we associate with the ocean. And I find that just incredibly interesting. So Tress is leaving her home of a salt rock, which we would associate with the smell of the ocean, but this is a huge part of growing up for her, and most of us know this exact feeling, setting off into the unknown with trepidation, yet determined to see that quest through to the end, no matter what the quest is. So now on to the second step of this process, the cognitive realm. How is Tress viewing herself, and how is she viewed by those around her?
We see at the end of this passage that Tress perceives herself as truly free, possibly for the first time in her life. I think she's also perceiving herself as more capable than she previously believed herself to be, especially after all her plans went off so smoothly. In that moment, she may even be experiencing a glimpse of that brilliance we discussed last episode that she and her parents had been working towards.
Yeah, she's on the precipice of that brilliance, on the first stage of her journey. And I can also imagine that she's viewing herself as successful in this moment. The plan went off, at least until now, without a hitch.
Emphasis on until now. But let's move on to the final step of the process, the spiritual realm. How are the souls of the characters or objects in this passage connected?
So the main objects in this passage are Tress and the boat and the ocean. I want to call back to episode 2 when we looked at the passage of Charlie leaving the island. We did this for our realmatic theory analysis segment as well, and we talked about how Tress may have felt connected to the boat that was taking Charlie away from her, maybe even praying for that boat to bring him safely home. And I can imagine that Tress is feeling a similar connection to the boat that she's currently on as it takes her to her destination, hoping as well for a safe return.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I imagine her relying on this new connection with this boat as she's experiencing a solo adventure for the first time. She has such a strong connection with her parents back at home, and also a strong connection with Charlie wherever he is, who she hopes to rescue. But in this passage, she's entirely alone by herself. So I see her relying on the comfort of those now distant relationships, while also feeling the connection to this boat and wishing for its safe passage, both to rescue Charlie and then also back home to her parents.
It's time for our final segment of the show, Hoyd's Advice. Listeners, if you are struggling with something or need a morale boost, send us a message and we'll share it here with a story to help you through the problem.
Today we have a message from our friend Derek who says, I'm going back to school in my late 20s and I'm surrounded by people I don't know in a place I'm not from. I feel like loneliness is unbeatable. Where do I find the confidence to make new friends?
This message nearly broke my heart. I feel this so deeply and understand the sentiment so well. I've lived a pretty nomadic life so far. Every few years, it feels like I'm in a new place, and I kind of prefer it that way. I like change. I like the challenge that it brings, but one of those challenges that I haven't yet solved is how to make new friends in the places that I live. So I don't know if I'm the right person to give you this advice because I struggle with this immensely. I've been pretty lucky in my friendships. Most of them are because I was in the right place at the right time. Case in point, my co-host, we met at Dragonsteel Nexus in 2024, and I was sitting alone at a table when Bethany and her husband sat down next to me and just started talking. They asked me who I was and what I was working on at the time. So really, I've relied on the kindness of others to foster my friendships. And I would say that the thing that's helped me is by going to do things where a lot of people are who share my same interests. You can do the same thing. And even if you don't have the courage to talk to anyone, maybe someone kind will notice you and say hello. We actually have a really good quote from later on in Tress of the Emerald Sea, something Hoyd says that I think we can apply to this particular situation. He says, "Truth is, people are just as fluid as time is. We adapt to our situation like water in a strangely shaped jug, though it might take us a little while to ooze into all the little nooks. Because we adapt, We sometimes don't recognize how twisted, uncomfortable, or downright wrong the container is we've been told to inhabit. We can keep going the way for a while. We can pretend to fit that jug, nooks and all. But the longer we do, the worse it gets. The more it weighs on us, the more exhausted we become, even if we are doing nothing at all, because simply holding the shape can take all the effort in the world. More if we want to make it look natural. If you're feeling like the jug you're in is a lonely one, try looking for a new jug. One that's got a bit of extra space for some other people to fill in the gaps. It might take some time to adapt to that new shape, and that's just fine. The longer you let yourself stay in that lonely jug, the heavier it will become. So I'd say, go out, find your people in the places where you feel the most welcome. Bookstores, game shops, libraries, concerts, sports bars, wherever it is that you feel at home, go there. Other people feel at home there too, and those are the people you want to surround yourself with.
I really love that you brought up the time where we met each other, Ben, because I think that you and I are unfortunately very similar in our struggle with this. I have to credit my husband, Abe, fully for our friendship because I'm not somebody who necessarily always has the courage to approach new people and form new connections without a little bit of a push. I'm very anxious 24/7, and I'm always concerned when I'm thinking about approaching new people about whether those people actually want to be talking to me or if they will be bothered by me approaching them. But my husband views things a lot differently, and he's somebody who wants to make sure nobody's being left out and really enjoys making new connections and doesn't feel that stress around it like I do. He's helped me a lot with getting out of my shell because he's facilitated a lot of those introductions that have led to friendships for me. But in the last couple of years, I've really pushed myself to make those connections when Abe isn't with me too. And I think the biggest thing I've learned is that the majority of the time people are kind and also eager to make friends too. In my first college class, I was in a huge lecture hall and I recognized someone I went to high school with but wasn't necessarily friends with in high school. I spent the 2-hour class just stressing and overthinking, as I do, trying to convince myself to just go up and say hi to her after class ended, and thankfully she was already staying after to ask the professor a question, which gave me the opportunity, that time that I needed to work up the courage to do this. It sounds so silly and sounds like the smallest thing, but at the time I really struggled so much with social anxiety. I was homeschooled for all but 3 of my K through 12 years, and that isolation led me to never being the one to initiate any of my friendships. And I'm so glad I did this because it turns out this classmate was a lot more outgoing than I am. She was excited to see a familiar face, and we sat together the rest of the semester and helped each other with homework and studying. And fast forward another year, we were best friends with weekly traditions of watching our favorite shows together and making dinners and grocery shopping. We even worked together at a couple different jobs. And now, a decade later, I'm about to be a bridesmaid in her wedding and have made so many new friends through her because of her introducing me to new people and helping me form those connections that I personally struggle with on my own. I know this story is a little bit specific because she was someone I did have a high school class with that I recognized, but I think it goes right back to what we talked about earlier in this episode with the idea of taking small steps towards brilliance. I never imagined I was capable of creating this friendship that I have now with her, but I did work up the courage to do the first step, which was simply approaching her to say hi. I can't guarantee the first person you introduce yourself to will be someone who's in your life a decade later, but I can assure you that more often than not, the other people in your class are also hoping to make friends and also hoping to talk to their classmates but aren't sure how either. Now, to this day, I still do struggle with putting myself out there. Some days are easier than others, but it has gotten easier with time, and I have built up that confidence that only comes from getting yourself outside your comfort zone one small step at a time. So I encourage you to also start taking those small steps. I love Ben's advice about going somewhere that you already feel at home, surrounded by people who have the same interests. So let's say that's a concert for you. Challenge yourself going in to strike up a conversation with just 1 or 2 people. It could be something simple like what their favorite song is from the artist, and it might lead into a longer conversation. But even if that conversation doesn't lead to you becoming friends with them, you'll still be walking away with practice under your belt. And I believe over time that these small conversations will lead to you finding people that are also looking for new friends and looking for that connection. This has been The Father and the Stowaway, episode 4 of Cosmere Journeys. I'm Bethany Davidson.
I'm Ben Grange, and to end every episode, we speak the ancient oaths. Life before death, strength before weakness, and, most of all, journey before destination.